We all want to hear from our three esteemed panelists. So welcome to our panel, which is titled A Sturdy Foundation, How Texas Can Follow Lincoln's Insistence on Teaching Reverence for the Constitution. And I will introduce our three speakers here in a moment after I've outlined the issue that we hope to address this afternoon. At the tender age of 29, Abraham Lincoln saw the disastrous effects that would follow if we failed to teach our students the fundamental principles of justice. Now, Lincoln gave a speech in 1838, as I say, he was 29, to the Young Men's Lyceum. It's called the Lyceum Address. And what Lincoln said then was this. He said, look, folks, the revolutionary generation is dying out. And with it is our allegiance and loyalty to the Declaration and the Constitution. And what Lincoln said he feared would happen with the decline of reverence would be the rise of what Lincoln called, quote, mob-ocratic rule. Mob-ocratic rule. Seattle and Portland, right? Now, Lincoln then said that the only antidote to our democratic degeneration, the only antidote to mob-ocratic rule was, and I want to quote this, was to teach, quote, reverence for the Constitution in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice, unquote. In my view, that's genuine civic education. But unfortunately, we've fallen so far from Lincoln's prescription that his admonition would appear to a good number of people in this country today as laughable. In fact, the very title of this panel, Teaching Reverence for the Constitution, would appear to some, unfortunately today, as laughable, and that's why we've chosen the title. But at the same time, who among us can doubt Lincoln's argument that a self-governing people can maintain their liberties only so long as the citizens continue to practice reverence for the principles that justify self-government? And who can doubt Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, or the Reverend Martin Luther King, who all argued that the foundations of these principles of justice are found in the Declaration of Independence's argument for human equality. So in short, what Lincoln tells us is that if we don't restore civic education, well, in the first place, our students will never know the arguments of Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln, in which case we can only expect more civic illiteracy across this country, as well as the decline into more mob-ocratic rule, of which we have been suffering very recently. Right? Let me just give a few more details on the current decline in civic education before we turn it over to our panelists. A new study finds that most Americans today would fail the U.S. citizenship test. Now, the U.S. citizenship test only consists of 10 questions. You only have to get 6 right to pass. And the 10 questions are taken from a 100-question database that you can review. Now, the good news is 91% of immigrants in this country pass the citizenship test the first time. The bad news is only 36% of native-born Americans can get even 6 out of 10 right. And when you go deeper into the numbers, it gets worse. There is an age gap. 74% of senior citizens pass the test, but only 19% of native-born Americans under the age of 45 can get even 6 out of 10 right. Right? You can't defend what you don't know. Right? Well, the question is what to do about this, because it's been said that the philosophy taught in the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy practiced in the legislature in the next generation. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then the precipitous decline in civic education in this country is absolutely terrifying. Thomas Jefferson told us that no nation can expect to be, quote, both ignorant and free, unquote. We expect immigrants in this country to pass the U.S. citizenship test, and the good news is they do. And yet 4 out of 5 of us who are under 45, I'm not one of them, can't even get 6 out of 10 questions right. So then the question is, what can we do about this? And to answer this question, we have 3 experts. And let me introduce them in alphabetical order. To my immediate left, I have David Bobb. David is the president of the Bill of Rights Institute, which he joined in 2013. Those of you who don't know about the Bill of Rights Institute, it's a good news story in what has otherwise been some somber news this afternoon. The Bill of Rights Institute is among the nation's leading providers of free, open education resources and professional development programs, both for high school teachers in both civics and in history. David is also the author of a book with a wonderful title, Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue. I love that title. He's also written for the Wall Street Journal, for Fast Company, and for the New York Post. To David's immediate left, Wendy Mae Dryer. Welcome, Wendy. Wendy is the board chair for iCivics, which is the nation's largest civic education provider. She recently retired from law practice and now devotes her time to child advocacy work through the Dallas CASA and World Vision. She also co-founded the Texas Civic Education Coalition, which is the first comprehensive bipartisan coalition to bring together educators, policymakers, content providers, and other key stakeholders with the goal of restoring genuine civic education in Texas. And then last but not least, joining us through Zoom is someone I think you all know, and that's Bob Woodson. Bob is the founder and president of the Woodson Center and 1776 Unites. During the 1970s, Bob directed the National Urban League's Administration of Justice Division, and he later served as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Many of us have seen him because he's a frequent commentator in print and in on-air media, including C-SPAN, CNN, Tucker Carlson, and more. He's a recipient of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Genius Fellowship Award, the Bradley Prizes presented by the Bradley Foundation, and the Presidential Citizens Medal. He's also the author of several books, including a book that's soon to be released. So we want to get the news out now so you can order it. Lessons from the Least of These, the Woodson Principles. Please join me in welcoming our 3 panelists. All right. Well, we're going to go around here from David to Wendy to Bob with a number of questions, and then we will save the last 15 to 20 minutes in order for you to ask questions. First question for you, David. We hear a lot today about civic being expressed as, quote, teaching for social justice, unquote. Could you tell us what that means?
Well, thank you, Tom, for the opportunity to join you. Thank you to the Texas Public Policy Foundation for convening this conversation. Civic education, as you opened with, should be about hearts and minds. When Lincoln issued that warning as a young man, and talked about the danger of mob-ocratic rule, what he went on to say in that very prescient speech is that the problem with mob-ocratic rule is that it makes the attachments of the people very difficult, that they become detached from the foundations, from the things that really buoy us up. And for us as Americans, a nation founded on the idea of freedom and equality for all, a detachment can quickly become a detestation. Unfortunately, what we see too often is that young people today are learning to not just be skeptics about the American founding and its principles, but to loathe it. At that point, what you will have, unfortunately, is more of that mob-ocratic spirit. My concern about social justice, or the idea of teaching for social justice, is that first, if you're talking to a group of 5th graders or 8th graders or 12th graders, at the Bill of Rights Institute, we work mainly with those age groups in the secondary schools, they have to understand what justice is. What is equality? What is freedom? That is a long and harrowing, actually very difficult journey. It takes a while. For a young person to be passionate about something and to say, I want to run out and do something right now, is very easy. For a young person to be dispassionate is very hard. Young people are brimming, just like we all are, with opinions, but education is not about opinions. When I was grading papers as a political science professor for Hillsdale College, I would mark out if a student said, here is what I feel about something. Not to be totally insensitive, though I was a little bit insensitive, just saying, that's not the main thing. The main thing is, what do you know? Education is about moving from opinion to knowledge. And if we too quickly short-circuit the process and go from the idea of teaching for social justice, which is really what too much of action civics becomes, we short-circuit the process of education. We substitute indoctrination and activity that really strays into activism for learning. Start with the learning. Build on that. There's plenty of skills that need to be imparted as part of education, but that's the main part of civic education that we have to focus on.
Thank you, David. Wendy, let me ask you this. You've taken a constructive role here.
Well, lean over so I can see
Yes.
it.
And you have, your organization has been working on a bill that's designed to address this problem. Would you like to tell the audience about it?
Love to. Yeah, so you heard Tom say, I work with Civics, which was started by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor to address these issues. I used to start some of these speeches having to roll out a bunch of statistics about, to convince people of how our democracy is declining. I don't have to do that anymore. What's going on in society proves the point for me, and I can short circuit straight to how do we deal with the problem. Sad that it's gotten to that point, but good from the standpoint that we can just jump right in. That's what we're trying to do here in Texas. iCivics, because of its market share as being the largest civic education provider, and because of our non-political way of dealing with this, we have the trust of the teachers and the education community. We are now going into places like Texas, and we have started, helped co-found with Bill of Rights Institute and TPPF, as well as 1776 Unites, a coalition here in Texas called the Texas Civic Education Coalition to address legislative needs, but not just legislative needs. And so we do have a bill that will be coming before the legislature this session. And understand the point of our legislation is because we are not trying to be prescriptive. We are not trying to push a standardized curriculum. That's not what we're here to do. That's not what the experts that we have assembled believe is the best policy. But what we know is we have got activists that are pushing very hard on the social justice reform front to put legislation in. There's bills sitting out there right now that have been filed this session. There was bills last session that address this, that are from a non-comprehensive standpoint, try to go into our schools and create an opportunity for project curriculum that turns into uninformed activism. And that's not what good civic education is. And so we are here to right that ship. In other words, we have decades now of good research and best practices on what will truly create informed, responsibly engaged citizens, and that is what our goal is. And so it starts with legislation because the time is right now, frankly, in Texas. The standards, called the TEKS in Texas, for those that don't know, are already scheduled, the social studies standards, to be revised in 2023. It's going to happen. And what we have to do as a state is make sure that we have given the Board of Education and the TEA the appropriate guardrails, the appropriate parameters by which those standards should be revised. And one of the things we've got to make sure we do is that we do not leave or alleviate or leave out in the revisions any of the good civic knowledge that Texas has in place now. We, as a state, compared to a lot of other states, still do a pretty good job of the foundational knowledge base in some of our age groups. We certainly don't want to lose any of that, and we want to build on the ability of teachers to teach founding principles and the foundational documents as part of the core knowledge. But we have to go further than that. We have to teach civic attitudes and skills. We have to teach these students from an early age, and this is a K through 12 problem. I don't want to morph too long, but the short of it is, in Texas, we have a 12th grade government course, and so there's a tendency to think, well, we've got a dedicated course, we're doing great, particularly when you compare us to other states. You can't wait to 12th grade to tell a student this basic knowledge information and send them out and expect them, pardon my language, to give a damn. I mean, it's just not going to work. You have to, from the very beginning, teach them why they should care that we have a democracy, why they should care about the Constitution. How we're different than other systems of government and why they should cherish that. It doesn't mean we're perfect, but there's a lot of good that they have to learn about, and we are wholesale skipping that in schools right now. And so part of the aim of this bill, and without using too much of my time right now, I can talk more about it later, is to address the gap in civic attitudes and skills that are just being ignored in the classroom right now. And the last piece of it is to provide professional development to teachers. The good teachers want to teach the right thing, and they're scared to death right now. They're scared of ending up on the front page of the newspaper because no matter what they say, it's going to be considered political, and they need to be taught how to teach this stuff in a safe way, how to handle current event discussions without it turning into a political minefield. And they're not getting that. While there's good PD programs out there right now, what we're hearing from our teachers is they're not being allowed to go to partake in those because superintendents are not giving them the time to go do it because there's, guess what, no funding in the social studies arena. It's going to STEM, and they're not given the time to go do this. So literally, the teachers that we see taking the professional development are sort of schlepping out into the dark of night without their principals or superintendents knowing about it to try to get training, and that is just wrong. We have got to address that issue. So those are some of the key points of the bill that we're bringing this session.
Thank you, Wendy. Bob Woodson, my question for you, I want to step back and look at this issue from the standpoint of American culture over the last 30 or 40 years. You've had a long and illustrious career as a civil rights attorney, as a community activist. My question for you is, what happened that led you to conservatism?
Well, first of all, I got mugged by reality. I was a liberal Democrat, civil rights activist, but once the civil rights laws were passed and I realized that the civil rights movement had morphed into a race grievance industry, and with the poverty programs pouring into the cities administered by liberal Democratic mayors, that 70% of those dollars were going not to the poor, but those who were serving the poor, and the government was really moving in and replacing the family. And so that's why I migrated towards conservatism. But to address this current problem of the Constitution, race, as you know, is being used as a weapon against the values of our founders. With the 1619 Project from the New York Times that has earned its author a Pulitzer, and the enemies of our nation are using America's birth defect of slavery, as expressed in 1619 Project by the New York Times, as a weapon to define America by its birthday of 1619, when the first 20 African slaves arrived on our shores. And their contention is, because of slavery, our birth defect, that America should be forever defined by that date and not 1776. And their conclusion, therefore, as a consequence, that all of our economy and everything was built on slavery, and therefore America is forever stained by it, and that all whites are victimizers to be punished, and all blacks are victims to be compensated and pitied. Well, we believe at the Woodson Center, because they're using the race issue as a bludgeon against this country, that those of us who love this nation, we felt obliged to also assemble 23 scholars and activists to come together to reassert the fact that the founding of this nation is 1776, and America should never be defined by its birth defect of slavery, because we are the only nation ever to have an Emancipation Proclamation and fought a war against slavery, and so that we are in the marketplace, but we're not offering a counter debate. We believe that we're offering a counter aspirational narrative, an inspirational narrative, and that we are bringing together activists. It's not, because right now, as your other guest pointed out, the teaching of civics is almost being criminalized. The music teachers are not supposed to be teaching children the Star-Spangled Banner. On Amazon, the leading book on the children's section is Communism for Kids. So there really is an all-out assault on our values and the Constitution. And so we at the Woodson Center are pushing back, and we believe that it's important to have the right messenger, since the radical left is using the history of blacks in this country. We are also a group of blacks pushing back and mimicking the Civil Rights Coalition. It was led by blacks, but we have participating with us different groups of people. And so we really believe that the defense of our Constitution, we must have as our goal at the Woodson to de-racialize race, and do what Samuel Adams said, is that democracy and capitalism are but empty vessels into which we pour our Judeo-Christian values as a nation. And so the only way that we can defend the Constitution is that we must also defend the founding principles, virtues, and values as well. But we must demonstrate it, not just issue white papers, but also to demonstrate that these principles have the consequence of helping to redeem and restore people's life.
Thank you. David, I want to do a follow-up from your answer to my first question. When we were talking about teaching for social justice, you mentioned action civics. For our audience here, would you define that?
Action civics works from the premise that there's real energy that young people have. That's logical and I think is sound. But oftentimes then what action civics does is say, because there's that energy, we need to channel it immediately and teach young people how to become political activists. That it's not enough to have the foundational knowledge and skills building, but you must propel students immediately into the position where they are almost being used as agents of change. Now, as I said earlier, I think the problem with this is that 16 and 17-year-olds, oftentimes propelled by adults into a particular direction, told that they're going to get academic credit and an academic grade for these things, are very suggestible. They're also running pell-mell into causes that they have not had a chance to really think through too often. And so rather than engaging in activism civics, which action civics all too often becomes, what we do at the Bill of Rights Institute, and there are many other organizations that join us in this effort, including iCivics, which is what do students need to know? What is it that should be studied? What should they reflect on? You know, Tom, you've asked us to reflect on the reverence for the Constitution. In that speech that Lincoln gave, he talks about the need for civic education to start from the time that we're just infants, lisping babes, as he puts it. We should hear it from preachers in the pulpit. But what we need to do is think about the Constitution and the Declaration as something that is worthy of deep, sustained reflection. Imagine if we could accomplish that in grades K through 12. That would be a huge win. You know, Representative John Lewis said on that day in 1963, the March on Washington. He was very young, about Lincoln's age, I think, when he gave the Lyceum speech. And Mr. Lewis said that the job that we had to do as Americans is completing the Revolution of 1776. And I think that alone is cause enough. Teaching reverence for the Constitution. That's a disposition, right? It's an affectation, it's an affection ultimately. And what we oftentimes, I think, get kids to do is to toe an agenda, toe a line. They're very good at that, right? They know that they want to get an A. And so the question is, what do we do with teachers? Let me close with this. I think it's really important to note that sometimes we've thought of teachers as defined only by the unions of which they're a part. All of the customers that we serve at the Bill of Rights Institute, 54,000 strong across all 50 states, these educators are card-carrying members of teachers' unions. However, what I see in their work every day, standing in front of young people, trying to bring some sense of what the unum is to e pluribus unum, knowing that that vocabulary, that richness of disposition forming is their life's calling, there are so many of them that are dedicated to that we need to befriend them. We need to give them the tools by which they can do this, because there are lots of other toolkits that are competing for their time. And it is an easy thing, and so many of our teachers know this, to propel students into political activism. It is a hard thing to get them to reflect deeply and to develop those affections of the heart. And what we found at the Bill of Rights Institute is when we give them the tools and we engage them and we treat them as professionals, that they reciprocate, and what we've created are bonds of civic friendship. And the reverberating effect of that is that each teacher every year is reaching about 100 students. And over the course of his or her career is going to reach 5,000. And what I'd suggest to you today is think of public policy solutions. Think of ways that in your own communities you can be involved in befriending teachers, creating those bonds, supporting them in the things, but treating them in a non-adversarial way, but supporting the good things that they're doing.
Thank you, David. And before we turn to Wendy, David has been kind enough to bring a couple of articles on this subject. And when we finish our panel here as you're leaving, we'll be passing those out to you. Wendy, I also want to follow up on your answer to your first question and tie it with David's description of and warning about action civics. You mentioned guardrails in the bill that you've put together. Could you tell us more about how those guardrails will help prevent the infiltration of action civics into the curriculum?
Sure. And you know, and David was accurate in his description of action civics. And the other problem with it is not just that you have uninformed activism, it also is not long-term is the problem. Research shows us that while you may capture those kids' attention for a very short time, get them impassioned about something, it dies off very quickly. So as they become adults and really, they don't have lifelong civic engagement. So that it's a twofold problem there. The reality in schools, and for the 21st century learner, you have to have, we can't just teach out of textbooks the way we did 50 years ago. You'll never capture their attention any longer. So teachers are constantly striving for experiential learning opportunities to bring the topics that they're teaching to life for the kids. That's a good thing. All the educational research tells us that's how to address children and get it to stick. The problem is there's that line between what's good experiential learning opportunities and what's like my own child's 12th grade government teacher did, which was say, hey, if you'll go do a political project, No description beyond that. That'll be a test grade. Because it's an easy way to do it. And the problem is you're just asking the kids to go find some, political group that wants to, take advantage of them. What we need to do, and what our bill does, is to put guardrails around this process and say, look, experiential learning opportunities are good. When you're in K through 5, you want to start teaching these students about community involvement, whether it's building a community garden or things like that, start working this sense into them that being part of a community is something we want to encourage. We want them to look for ways to engage in their community. But as they get through middle school and high school, where the dangers become a little more ripe, we want to be able to have, first of all, any experiential learning opportunities need to be nonpartisan. They can't be of a political nature. They need to be steeped in the curriculum. In other words, students don't just get the opportunity, or the teachers instructing the students, to just go out and find a political project, or the class as a whole going out and invoking on the free project that some political activist group has brought them to do. Instead, it has to be a topic that is steeped in the curriculum that's already been approved by the school board and the TEA. So those are a couple of ways that we can put guardrails around it. Some of the other things we're doing is mandating that media literacy, become part of the curriculum, so that we're teaching the civic skills by which students can begin to understand when they're being presented with something and asked to be activists without being first taught what really is at the heart of the issue. They can start learning this for themselves. And the other piece is what I mentioned before. A big piece of this is professional development. Teachers don't know how to address these issues today without it turning into a catastrophe. So either they do it and it's a bad turnout, or they just don't touch it because they're so scared of it. And part of that goes back to our higher institutions. Our pre-service teachers, we can actually graduate in Texas from our public institutions, teachers who may go teach government and haven't had any government or history since high school. But they're going to become a government teacher. So there's things like that can be done as well in terms of better training of our pre-service teachers. But for the teachers that are already out there, we need extensive professional development. And that's part of what our coalition is doing, is bringing together the right players who have good quality curriculum and professional development. And frankly, we're raising the money for it. We're not even asking the legislature for money for this. So we may have the only bill in this session that's free. But we're taking on the burden ourselves of raising the money so that we can cover the professional development needs throughout a state the size of Texas to make sure our teachers are adequately trained.
Thank you, Wendy. And your point about the tough straits in which our teachers find themselves is very much on point. In fact, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, beginning last summer, we now hold a Summer Civics Institute in which we have teachers come from all across the state. High school teachers in 8th grade, because 8th grade is the last time Texas K-12 students get the American founding. They don't get it in high school. And in the very first class of these teachers, a woman who teaches 8th grade civics said, she told the whole class, she said, by the time students today are middle school age, she said they come to school already cynical about the American regime. Already cynical. Now, Aristotle would say it's almost too late at that point. When Aristotle talks about teaching, he says, you don't tell little kids the reasons for your orders, right? You don't go into all these. Instead, at a young age, you teach them to love the right things and to hate the right things. And then that will incentivize their souls, that love. When they get older, they will be receptive to the ideas. Now let's hope Aristotle is wrong, that it may already be too late. But Mr. Woodson, the question I wanted to ask you is, the 1776 Unites Project is a direct response to the 1619 Project. Where do you think this national debate is going to go? What do you think will be the final resolution?
Well, I guess I'm a little puzzled because every other education, the state boards of directors are coming to us because most states are required to teach critical race theory. And this is sweeping across every state that we have seen. We're getting complaints that teachers are not permitted to teach the Star-Spangled Banner, and that they're having mandatory classes about racial discrimination, and it's very, very pervasive. And so I'd like to know how Texas has avoided what is going on around the country, because 1619 curriculum has now been distributed by the Pulitzer Institute and is being imposed on every school system that we have seen so far. And so what we have done is offer an alternative curriculum that extols the virtues of American founding principles and give examples of these. But this is an ongoing struggle, and it is getting worse. And that's why we put together 1776. And so I was just curious from my colleagues from Texas whether or not this racial, critical race theory and this emphasis on America's racial past has affected curriculum and teacher training, teacher hiring in the state of Texas. Because if somehow you have found a way to insulate yourself from it, we certainly would like to know about it so we can share with others around the country.
Well, sir, I'd like to say we've insulated ourselves from it, and I hope that proves to be true, and the two other folks here we've got on the panel are doing their best to make sure that we're insulated from it. And just for our audience's knowledge here, when you hear 1619 Project or Action Civics or Teaching for Social Justice, they all mean the same thing. Or critical race theory, they all mean the same thing. Whereas the Declaration of Independence teaches us that what we share in common is far more important than what separates us, teaching on human equality. What these new ideologies teach us, these destructive ideologies, is that instead of a common humanity that we share, as the Declaration says, instead we are forever separated by race, class, and gender, right? The new unholy trinity of the postmodern age.
And Tom, to directly address what Bob was saying, specific in Texas, I mean, make no mistake, it's coming here. I mean, Texas, to the extent we've insulated ourselves, it's only because we're such a big state and we hold very closely the values of autonomy within individual school districts and things like that. But there's a bill out there right now that's before this legislative session that's seeking, and it was around last session as well, seeking to have a semester of project curriculum essentially. And what happens is school districts can't afford the good quality resources that are built around a project curriculum. iCivics does resources for free, but we don't do a project curriculum because we don't think that's the right thing to do. So what happens in the inability to afford any good resources, there are a plethora of groups wanting to come in to teach critical race theory. This is how they get it in, because you're not going to have a standardized, civics or history curriculum in Texas. We're very opposed to that as a state. It's not likely to happen. But the way it will come in is this way, through the project curriculum. When you don't have comprehensive civic education that starts with a strong foundation in the knowledge of your institutions and the knowledge of your founding principles, and then the correct attitudes that teach you why to care and protect about our constitutional democracy, and even far more local issues as well. Then through the project curriculum, they start indoctrinating the students on these various iterations of critical race theory are basically reinventing American history. And this is how it comes in. And so while we've been fortunate so far in Texas, and when I talk to teachers groups, there are a lot of them that have never even heard that term, which is rare compared to what's happening in the rest of the United States. It's coming, make no mistake. And if we're lazy about this, if we don't pay attention to what's coming, we'll be faced with, passing legislation that opens the door for this very thing to come in.
I'd agree with that, but also add that I think it's already here in this sense, that even in a state where you all as Texas taxpayers spend $400 million a year on textbooks, $400 million a year on textbooks, there's a lot of autonomy that individual high school teachers especially have to choose what they will. So the bureaucrats say, oh no, they're using the textbooks to the tune of 1 out of 2 days. The teachers tell us, and we built our business model around this, that it's 1 out of 5 days. The teachers take that taxpayer-funded textbook, set it aside, and go to the internet and choose what they will. And so they're already grabbing things that they can. And so it's a bigger kind of marketplace. And that gives me both pause for concern, but also confidence that if we continue to be assiduous in supplying the resources, there will be legislation, and we want good legislation, but the main thing that's going to be happening here is parents and teachers and communities figuring out what they want to go into young people's heads and hearts. And that's where we have to really devote the bulk of our attention, I'd suggest.
Thank you, and thank you both for your points. And Wendy, thank you for that clarification. So it seems that we need to add to our list of synonymous terms: critical race theory, 1619 Project, Action Civics, Teaching for Social Justice, and project-based curriculum. You hear any of those 5 terms, put your hand over your wallet. All right, good, thank you. Thank you for that. David, how would a genuine civic education present to students the events of January 6th?
This is the question that every teacher woke up with the next morning. And Wendy, what you alluded to, I think, is so often the paralysis that sets in. Because imagine you do that and you've gotten a memo that day from your building principal or your district superintendent saying, you know, that stuff that happened, we're not really going to go there. That happened in hundreds of cases that we know about. But there's a zeitgeist out there that basically says, don't go there. Why? Because there's a voice of dissent that might come in and say you're not teaching it quite right, or you said something wrong. And so teachers just clam up. The same thing that is happening in terms of chilled speech on our university campuses is happening in high school and middle school big time. And what we have to do, and what we do at the Bill of Rights Institute, is equip teachers so that they have a ready thing in their inbox that morning. And we had a playlist out that evening, in fact, of January 6th. And the playlist went back to George Washington. What did it mean to have a peaceful transfer of power? It also went to an example in which George H.W. Bush left a note saying that I'm rooting for you, President Bill Clinton, to succeed. What does it mean to have a peaceful transfer of power? It also pointed people to Lincoln, that you can frame that by talking about mob-ocratic rule. So what you do is you start with the current event, you start with the news, you frame it, but you also accomplish the things that you know that you need to so that it doesn't turn into a kind of melee between students parroting partisan points. Because every teacher knows that they want to move on from that opinion to knowledge. And so that's what I'd suggest, the kind of thing that a lot of teachers are willing to do. They need to hear it from you all. They need to hear it from parents, from stakeholders in the community, that they have the support so long as they're doing a viewpoint diverse, carefully grounded in as much as possible primary source documents and a discussion of these things. If we do not instill the habits for students to be able to be challenged in their own viewpoint with others, they're not going to acquire them after they graduate from high school.
Thank you. It's now time to open up for questions from the audience. And we have someone here who will be bringing by.
While he's doing that, can I add to one thing David said?
Yes, you go right ahead.
It's not just supporting the teachers. They need to know, we have got to stand up through legislation as parents, as community leaders, and let the school administrations know as well.
Yes.
That we support this activity happening in the schools, these discussions happening, and that they need to support their teachers in this. Because even the good social studies teachers, and we see a lot of them, that really want to do the right thing here, feel completely unempowered to do so because of their administration.
Yes, thank you. Before we turn to audience questions, Bob Woodson, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll
Okay.
really take questions. So.
Fair enough. Good.
Okay, I want to key off Dr. Lindsay's comment about, and his buddy Socrates, about how at young ages you teach what's good and bad, and more of a rhetorical, I guess, a rhetoric. That's why the Pledge of Allegiance, nobody understands the strength of the Pledge of Allegiance, let's say, until you've been in the military and war, et cetera, like that. And there is a war going on in this, life of ours, right? That's good, as long as you're armed with the principles. And so I'm a scouter, and we have both boys and girls now. And we do the Pledge of Allegiance, but we also do the Scout Oath, the 12 lists of the Scout Oath, which the boys and girls dutifully recite, trustworthy, loyal, so forth. Nobody understands that until you're married or you're in some kind of jam, right? So what I'm asking, and this is the question, would it be okay in the early, first, second, third grade to have these kids recite the preamble to the Constitution? Because the preamble of the Constitution embeds the principles that move forward. Because the Constitution is big and long and got lots of stuff associated with it. But the preamble is very succinct and it's beautiful. And if these kids recite it, you can leverage off that as they get older.
All right. Who would like to address that question?
I'll jump in and say absolutely. I have 2 boys, they're 9 and 11. Stories are the way to do it, but also that deep imbibing. Memorization is a great thing for young people to do. They're sponges, we know that. And the ancients teach us that it's that habituation. And you habituate towards the love of freedom. And Tom talked about we also have to teach the loathing of certain things. You loathe tyranny. And the way that you do that is by putting up exemplary stories. Bob Woodson has given us some examples that are not well enough known. There are many that the Bill of Rights Institute has published of those who are well known and those who are not. We call them American portraits. We've just published a history of the United States, and they're full of stories. Oftentimes in the textbooks today, they put the stories in the sidebar. And they would put that kind of a suggestion that maybe because I'd add to your suggestion that we have, like they did, Laura Ingalls Wilder notes that on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence in its entirety was recited by heart. It's okay to show a kind of reverence, because that's, after all, what we're talking about today. Reverence comes from love, and they build off of each other. And so when you habituate young kids' hearts to that, it doesn't mean that critical thinking goes out the door, right? Because as they get older, then they start to say, okay, what does the preamble mean? What is the preamble, the preambulatory paragraphs to the Declaration mean? And at each age group, you're giving that kind of patriotic habituation, but it is thoughtful.
Wendy, Bob, any responses, or should we go on to the
Well,
next
I
question?
agree, and I think the biggest point David made is it's the application of, and I think there are schools in Texas where in later elementary grades and certainly early middle school where they do still memorize and recite the preamble or things like that. The problem is even when that happens, that's where it ends. It's just a list of things that they recite, and there's no application for these kids as to, again, going back to the civic dispositions, the civic attitudes about what that should mean in their life currently. And so it's what in education call a scaffolding issue. You have to start, it's not wholly dissimilar. For a while in Texas, decade, maybe 15 years ago, we had a big push for character-based training in the elementary school level. It's not wholly different from that. You can kind of build upon that. You can see how these same principles can be introduced in the elementary grade levels as a character thing, caring about your fellow human being, caring about the sense of community and working together towards a goal of bettering your community, things like that. And so you have to take these founding principles and documents and then apply them in a way that is meaningful in their life today. And you intensify that as they get older and older so that it becomes building blocks.
Thank you. Bob, anything you want to add before the next question? Good? Okay. Go ahead.
All right, so real quick, I just want to touch on, I'm so encouraged to hear that y'all are going to be getting involved with the TEKS and the social studies. I was at the SBOE in 2018 when they were streamlining the social studies TEKS, and there was a motion actually to remove teaching of the First Amendment from the standards. Thankfully, that was defeated, but there was precious few people there advocating to keep that. So I look forward to having more folks there.
Well, and that's why point 1 of our legislation, our bill, is that none of that can be removed. What's in there now can't be removed.
Good. My question is, as I've gotten more involved in TEKS and some of the education standards, we've started to see this movement to put kind of civic education and specifically some of the critical race theories things into other areas where it's not traditionally seen, right? So, for example, here in Austin ISD, we saw their sex education in 3rd grade instruct students to challenge homophobia, which they defined as someone believing in traditional marriage. And so they're getting these students to take this civic action against their fellow students and against the general populace at a younger and younger age in a way that is not what we traditionally think of as civic education. How do we counteract that?
That may be the question of the day. Who would like to be the first to address that?
I think one of the key things that we have to think about, for example, is English language arts. We can take other subject areas. We have a project in the works with Johns Hopkins University to take the 4,000 resources that BRI has developed in civics and history and redeploy them in a way that it would be useful at each grade level in that kind of scaffolding exercise. So that when you're teaching young people how to read, let them reflect on things that are enriching to their souls. So that's one practical way that we can become more interdisciplinary. Humane Letters programs, as some of you might be familiar, wed the teaching of English language arts, English literature with history. There's things like that that have a more liberal kind of humane way of building out those things so that you mitigate against the politicized kind of weaponized use of curriculum. Curriculum should not be used as a cudgel in any direction, in any political direction. And that's something that I think we're going to have to become smarter about, forging some coalitions beyond what has come to be known as social studies and going back to those more traditional notions of history, civics, and the teaching of reading.
Let me just add that I think in terms of building coalitions, it is important to consider reaching out to some of these Black and minority communities, because a lot of these social justice efforts are done in the alleged name of promoting social justice for Blacks.
Right.
Most Black communities reject this notion that they are a victim and that they are defined by disabilities produced in society. And so when you're pushing back against these critical race theories and it is and others, it's important to go directly to minority communities in whose name these so-called justice steps are taken, and let them speak for themselves, as we're doing at the Woodson Center with some of these initiatives. In other words, the moral authority that the left is using to promote these initiatives, they're doing this in the name of justice for minorities. Well, if minorities push back and withdraw that moral authority, it can really go a long way of the mounting of resistance to it.
Yes.
And the good news is I was on the phone, actually on the drive down here, with a member of the Board of Education who wants Bob to come speak with them as a group to better educate them on these very issues. And you know, the short answer to your question is you're not going to ever stop it, absent a standardized curriculum. You know, but then the risk is you've got a standardized curriculum, right? And so the only way you're going to combat it, and again, that's why we feel like the coalition we built here in Texas is so important, where we can vet, and we've been working with the Commissioner of Education about being sort of the portal through which resources become vetted for teachers so they know these are safe resources. This is not a resource that has a hidden agenda behind it. Are there going to be teachers that want their classroom to be agenda-based? There are, but I've really found those to be few and far between. Most teachers really, they're not looking for that. They get surprised by it is what happens. And so we just have to be ever vigilant in our coalition work, in the resources we're providing, and educating our Board of Education and educating the TEA. And again, our coalition is working to be part of the committee that's going to be looking at revising the TEACs for that very purpose, so we can make sure we get guardrails around it, so we're not being prescriptive, but we're lessening the opportunity for groups to come in with a hidden agenda.
Thank you. Other questions? I have a question for the three of you, which I see now we only have 4 minutes left anyway, so this will be the final question. And you've talked about this a little bit, but what I want you to address in detail for our audience here with regard to what they can do. I think what you three have shown us today is that civic education is ground zero in our culture war. Right? If we lose the battle over civic education, we've lost the country. Right? But we're not giving up. We're fighting back in the face of these assaults on our principles. What I'd like you three to do is to tell the members of our audience what they can do in whatever capacity they can to advance. Go ahead, David.
In whatever community you're in, befriend a teacher or two. Tell them that you appreciate what they're doing, get to know them as a human being, and then you'll be in a place to be able to give them feedback based on what they're doing in the classroom in these particular subject areas. We endeavor at the Bill of Rights Institute to double our reach by the year 2026. On July 4th of that year, is it going to be a celebration of our 250th birthday, or is there going to be a lamentation? I think that's going to be determined on what we do kind of in these interpersonal engagements, one with another. Share resources too. The great thing about the civic education community is that through the provision of our benefactors, these resources are free. The history resource that I mentioned, you can use. You can pull together a playlist and share that with your friends and neighbors. Keep pointing those debates back to foundational things, because that's the essence of civic education. So there's some materials, as Tom mentioned there, from the Bill of Rights Institute. Please grab those. Happy to chat with you about what we can do in your community.
Thank you.
I would say don't put your head in the sand. Don't think because the battle hasn't been as ferocious here in Texas that it's not coming here. And those that have an agenda and they want to get it into our classrooms are working very hard to make that happen, and they're gaining ground. The good news is, iCivics has been in this for, decades, and we have seen it's slow progress, but we have seen the improvement in the numbers. Certainly on the civic knowledge front, and where we're really trying to invest our efforts now is, again, like I said, on the civic skills and attitudes piece of this. And we're seeing progress get made. So there is hope that we can turn this around. I don't believe it's too late, but we're running out of time. I can remember a time when we used to have to convince people that civic education was the solution to the civic problems in the country. And I will tell you that groups that never played in this arena before are coming to us in droves, basically saying we've tried everything else. Maybe you're actually onto something here. So that's good news. People are paying attention. Now is the time to grab that momentum and move it forward and really advance the ball here. So,
thank you, Wendy. Bob?
I just want to warn you that a tidal wave of racial grievance is coming your way. There are people who are promoting socialism, and they are using our tortured past, our birth defect of slavery and Jim Crow as the bludgeon to attack our civic institutions. I hope and pray that white America will begin to have race fatigue and join with the Woodson Center in becoming woke busters.
I love that. Woke busters.
Excellent, thank you. Well, as you can see here, you've heard a lot of bad news, a lot of frightening news, but you've also heard that there are good people standing up and who are fighting. And the only thing I would add is to what we can do if go to your school board meetings, right? As boring as they can be, that's where the sausage gets made. One of our members of our audience raised the issue about the so-called streamlining in 2018 and what that led to. Another thing that was proposed in 2018 was to remove the word heroic in front of the TEAC, which says, teach the history of the heroic defenders of the Alamo. They wanted the word heroic, and then when they were pressed on it, they said, well, it's too value charged, right? Now, they didn't get away with it. Why? Because people like you stood up, and that's the only way it's going to happen, right? We have good people in government who are aware of this issue, but in the end, it's up to us, right? Parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, they're the ones who care the most about students, right? The battle is ours. Thank you very much for attending our panel, and please join me in thanking our three panelists.